So let's get started. Oh, coffee is coming. Is that right? Am I presuming things? Let's see what is. Okay. Great. Sorry. Okay, so now we are going to start to look at some of the kind of core issues that we're going to look at on this retreat. We're going to start looking at dependent origination. And the particular sutta we're going to have a look at is called the Maha-Nidana Sutta, translated by here by Bhattacharya as the Great Discourse on Causation, which I think is a reasonable translation. And this is probably the most well-known of all the suttas on dependent origination, paṭicca-samuppāda. There is, however, a large number of suttas on this topic. And if you want to read more about the dependent origination, the place to go is the Nidana Sañutta, the connected discourses on this topic, found in the Sañutta Nikaya, the connected discourses of the Buddha. And there's a whole chapter there, chapter 12 of that collection, which is all about dependent origination. That's where you find the main suttas on this topic. But there are scattered suttas about dependent origination found throughout the four Nikayas and even beyond the four Nikayas. So, for example, in the Majjhima Nikaya, there is an important sutta called the Maha-Tanha-Sankhya Sutta, which is all about dependent origination. That is number 38, I think. 38, yeah, should be number 38. And there are also some suttas in the Anguttara Nikaya, the numerical discourses, that are important for this topic. And especially one sutta, which I will be referring to as we go through this, and that is found in the Anguttara 3, is number 61. It's called the Titiya Sutta, the suttas on ascetics of other sects. Yeah, please, we wait for, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So,
Sorry, I'm late.
That's okay, no problem at all. Yeah. It's amazing how you can find your way so easily without astonishing. So these are some of the suttas that we find on this important topic. And one of the reasons, some of the reasons why dependent origination is so interesting, there's a number of reasons for that, but it is a very, very rich teaching. Yeah, it includes almost everything there is in Buddhism. The various principles of Buddhism are found within dependent origination. It is the idea of causality is fundamental to the whole Buddhist teaching, and this particular sequence brings out the idea of causality in a very clear way. It is not limited to dependent origination. Everything in Buddhism really comes back to causality and conditionality, but this kind of brings this out in a very powerful way. And it is important because it shows the ultimate causes of the problem of suffering, the problem of rebirth and all of these kind of things. And it shows it in a way whereby you can you get a feeling for this whole process of samsaric existence, how this idea of rebirth and re-death, re-old age, re-death is kind of a nice idea, isn't it? And so you're kind of going around and around and around in this way, and it shows you, to my mind, in a very convincing way, how this process actually happens. And to me, it was always important to get a good feeling for the Buddhist teachings, an overall view of these teachings, how it all is integrated into a coherent whole. And that gives you a sense that these are, it gives you a feeling that this is something you can trust, something you can confidence in, because it is a very well worked out system. It seems to be someone who has some very profound insight into the nature of reality, who were able to come up with something that is so unique in human history, the idea of dependent origination. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have any antecedents at all in other traditions. There are some people who have argued that some of the aspects of dependent origination can be found in the earlier Brahmanical tradition. And some of the most interesting or some of the most important texts in the Brahmanical tradition are known as the Upanishads. And the Upanishads seem to have certain aspects that are similar, or have some ideas that kind of could have been the precursors to the idea of dependent origination, because everything has a precursor somewhere. Nothing is ever completely in this world, completely new. Yeah, there's no such thing. Everything is based on other things. Everything is development of what had existed before. That's just the nature of the world, I think it's fair to say. So dependent origination shows us the problem of suffering with a clear causal sequence. It gives us an idea how this process is to be undone, going back to the most root cause. It shows us the process of rebirth, how that happens without a reference to the self, without a reference to some kind of inherent entity that is always going to be there. It shows us how this structure works. We're going to see this later on, how consciousness itself turns out to be dependent on other phenomena, so that in this way, this process carries on without any reference to a self or some inherent characteristic in human beings, any other being for that matter. This is karma and rebirth and five khandhas, and all of these things are included in one way within this idea of dependent origination. So let's get started. And so this then is the Digha Nikaya Long Discourses number 15, the Great Discourse on Causation. And as I was doing yesterday, I'm just going to start to read it out, and then I'm going to comment on this as we go along. So this is how it goes. So I have heard at one time the Buddha was staying in the land of the Kurus, near the Kuru town named Kamasa Dhamma. Then Venerable Ananda went up to the Buddha, bowed, sat down to one side, and said to him, "It is incredible, sir, it is amazing, in that this dependent origination is deep and appears deep. Yet to me, it seems as plain as can be." So that's an interesting start, and as you can imagine, and you will see, the Buddha is not entirely impressed by this statement of Venerable Ananda, and I think maybe he hasn't gone slightly too far. But let's just start from the beginning here. So the Buddha is staying in the land of the Kurus, and the land of the Kurus is a very important area of India. It was the area where the Brahmanical religion, or the Brahmins, were the stronghold of the Brahmins. And there was a very famous town there called Kurukshetra, which goes back to Vedic times, and there are archaeological finds that have discovered this particular town. It is not so far from where Delhi is found in India in the present day. So it is quite a bit outside of the ordinary area where the Buddha taught. The Buddha was taught mostly in the eastern part of India, in the Ganges plain. And this is kind of the very extremity towards the west, as far as he would go to the west. If you look at the area of India where the Buddha taught, it's quite a small area. I mean, small as several hundred kilometers across both ways. So when you had to go by foot, of course, it would be quite large. But nevertheless, it is not, compared to the size of India, it is still quite small. This would have been one of the Brahmanical strongholds. And it is possible that some of these profound suttas were maybe taught there because maybe the Brahmins were, they were already philosophizing, and they were very famous for their philosophizing. And maybe so these profound suttas would have been taught as a counterpart, maybe to the philosophizing of the Brahmins. Possibly, it was just one way of looking at this. So that is where the Buddha taught this particular sutta, in the land of the Kurus. And then the Venerable Ananda says this kind of remarkable statement to the Buddha that, to him it seems really plain, even though dependent origination is profound. And obviously, Venerable Ananda was a stream enterer, so he would have understood dependent origination, certainly the basic ideas of it and how it functions. But it is not necessarily the case, just because you understand the basic principle, the basic idea of conditionality, does not necessarily mean you understand all the details, all the working out of this dependent origination. In fact, I think it is very hard to understand that, and I certainly make no claim myself to understanding all the details. But what we can understand is the basic principle of dependent origination. I think that is possible for all of us to grasp. But it is such a rich teaching that you can always go into more details. You can always look at it from new points of view. And we're not going to go into all the details now, because that will take a lot more time. But we're going to look at the essential ideas behind this. So this is what the Buddha replies then when Venerable Ananda makes this statement. He says, "Don't say that, Ananda, don't say that. This dependent origination is deep and appears deep. It is because of not understanding and not penetrating this teaching that this population has become tangled like string, knotted like a ball of thread, and matted like rushes and reeds. And it doesn't escape the place of loss, the bad place, the underworld, transmigration." So he says that, this is more profound than you might think. Yeah, that's basically what he's saying. It is deep, and it appears deep. I think this is one of those interesting little statements that very often in the world it's very easy to take something that seems to be deep as actually being deep. Yeah, things on the surface can actually seem profound, but when you look more closely, actually it may not be all that profound at all. And sometimes you find people who are extraordinarily clever at making up really profound sounding statements. You think, wow, that's really cool. Yeah, what are they actually saying? I have no idea what they're saying, but it sounds really profound. And then you are kind of led astray by some kind of dodgy teacher who's actually, some people can be extraordinarily clever, but the cleverness is actually no substitute for the profundity of what they're supposed to be talking about. One of the kind of statements that comes to mind was a statement by one of these scallywag teachers who said something to the effect that, what did he say again? I'm going to get this right. He said something to the effect that I'm so detached, I'm not even attached to detachment. Right? That sounds, wow, what is going on here? And of course, what is going on is that he was one of these people who kind of amassed a large fortune of wealth, right? And he had he was famous for having all these Rolls Royces and having all of these kind of things, and lots of disciples, lots of kind of dodgy stuff going on in some of these communities. And of course, this was his kind of excuse, for having lots of wealth. I'm not even attached to detachment. And so he was kind of beyond the idea, this kind of crazy wisdom idea, beyond the ordinary ideas of the world. So we had to be careful not to be led astray by these things. We had to use our common sense. Spirituality should be reasonable. It shouldn't be something outlandish outside of our ordinary understanding. If something seems to be astray, probably it is astray. Yeah, that's usually the way things are. So don't trust your own judgment. Don't allow yourself to kind of be have the wool kind of, across your eyes or whatever, however that saying goes again. So we need to be sensible about these things. So things should appear deep and be deep at the same time. And we need to investigate carefully. And we should not go with the crowd. Don't go with the crowd. If the whole world says this person is enlightened, be careful. What the whole world says very often turns out to be wrong. Of course, in the case of the Buddha, many people are probably right that he was enlightened, that he was awakened, and he was talking about it. But it is often not true. It is often not reliable, because a lot of people are, the majority of people tend to be like sheep. They go along. Everyone else thinks it's true, so it must be true. And I think this is a very important principle. I have seen myself in so many cases during my time as a monk of people saying, oh, this person is enlightened. And if you say that they are not enlightened, you're making bad karma. And it's like creating this fear culture where you cannot actually say that someone may not be enlightened because their conduct is bad. But if someone has bad conduct, someone needs to say something, because if you don't say anything, it's the abuse or the negative thing is just going to carry on. It's just going to move on from one abused person to the next one. It is a very bad idea not to say anything when bad things are happening. So we need to be open about these things. We need not to be afraid. And in fact, the Buddha says that to go around claiming that someone is enlightened who is not, that actually is bad. That is actually, that if you want to make bad karma, well, that is one way of making bad karma. So it is actually the opposite of what people say. If there are reasonable grounds for thinking someone is a bad person doing the wrong thing, we should say this thing. If we don't, actually that is very problematic, and we're probably making bad karma by doing that. So keep that in mind. There's often the reverse of what people say. People are really afraid of saying bad things about supposedly enlightened teachers. And I think this is one of the things that lead to the downfall of spiritual communities and downfall of Buddhism also in many places. If we're not honest about what is actually happening, what is going on. I think it's a very important thing to do. But of course, we should be careful with what we say. We should not come to hasty conclusions. If you come to hasty conclusions and you don't investigate properly, well, that is also bad. You should investigate properly, and then after investigating properly and carefully, then if you come to a conclusion that is the opposite of everyone else, well, you should trust yourself. Don't be kind of led around by the crowds, because the crowd often turns out to be wrong. And there are suttas about these things I just been mentioning. They found in the Anguttara Nikaya, in the early chapters 1 and 2, when these things are talked about specifically, about how it is right to deal with people who have a bad conduct and wrong view, and how it is appropriate to talk about it. Anyway, so things are deep and they appear deep. It's an important point in that little statement there. What I love about this teaching, that there's things everywhere. Everything the Buddha says is full of meaning. So every time there's a little statement about something, it is really worthwhile listening and trying to draw out the meaning behind what may seem very obvious on the surface. And then the Buddha says it is because of not understanding and penetrating this teaching. And then he has this beautiful series of pictures here. The population has become tangled like string, knotted like a ball of thread, matted like rushes and reeds. The idea is that we are so involved in the world. We are often so attached in such profound ways, in such complicated ways. We become like this, knot. I don't know if you have ever, when I was young, long before I became a monk, but in my teens or early teens even, I went fishing. Don't tell anyone. It's kind of bad things that I did when I was young, and I didn't really understand what I was doing. And so I went fishing, and sometimes the fishing line would get really tangled up, right? And you get this knot that was impossible to kind of pull apart again there. And that's a bit like what life is like. We are this knotted people, knotted into existence with various kind of attachments. We have attachments to views, we have attachment to people, we have attachment to practices and ways of doing things. And we have, because of the attachments, we say things that are a bit dodgy. And then because we say dodgy, we have to kind of hide what we're saying. And it gets so extraordinarily complicated. With this, things kind of being kind of, everything is kind of exactly like it says here, yeah? It's kind of matted like reeds and rushes, matted, like matted hair, yeah, like Rastafarian hair, where everything's like kind of together in kind of one not impossible to get out again. The only way is to become a monastic, shave off your hair and beard. And this is the best way to kind of go from straight from Rastafarianism to becoming a monastic. Yeah. We have a few examples of that. There's no other way to get those kind of dreadlocks unlocked, right? So they are matted like reeds and rushes and reeds. So this is our life, yeah? We're so entangled there. And actually, when you start to entangle this, it can be very hard. It can be very difficult. And one of the most hardest things maybe on the Buddhist path is to be honest with ourselves, to actually see where our desires and attachments are. What are our problems? What are the issues with me? And it can be painful to see that in ourselves because we want to feel good about ourselves. We don't want to kind of see our problems. You might feel a bit negative about yourself once you start seeing your problems. But actually it is necessary. It is necessary to uncover all of these attachments, all of these tangles, and then gradually untangle ourselves from samsaric existence. And the only way to do that is to be honest. But be honest wisely. Don't kind of take everything on board straight away because you might end up being depressed. But do things gradually, yeah, and gradually untangle this web of matted attachments that we have. And as you do that, the path starts to clear up and you start to see what you have to do now. And one of those beautiful little sayings that you find, I think it's in the Dhammapada, I think, in one of the favorite Buddhist books. And when the Buddha says something to the effect that if someone points out a fault in you, yeah, usually when people point out faults, we say, get lost, don't want to hear about it. Yeah, we get defensive and we kind of run away, we don't want to hear about it. But when the Buddha says, if someone points out a fault in you, you should see it as a treasure. Kind of extraordinary, yeah? It's almost the exact opposite of what we normally do. Of course, most people, when they point out a fault in us, they do so for stupid reasons. People get upset and angry, and then they point out a fault, and you know that you don't have to take it seriously because it's just the other person reacting in a bad way. Yeah? But sometimes people actually do point out things that are very useful, things we can't really see ourselves, flaws in our character where we do the things that actually are, not really balanced or whatever it is. And having that ability then to listen, yeah, it's actually very, very useful. Maybe they're right. And maybe it hurts to know that they are right. But maybe that hurt is worthwhile. Sometimes short-term hurt can actually lead to long-term benefits. Yeah, so this is kind of this idea of this honesty that is required on the Buddhist path to really untangle ourselves. And if we want to be deluded, if we want not to see what is there, this is how most people live their lives. They don't really want to know the reality of the truth, because the truth can be painful. But if we don't want that, then of course, then you're not really going to be successful on the spiritual path, because you have to untangle these things. But be careful. Yeah, you have to know that you are ready. Sometimes we are ready to hear the truth. Sometimes we are not. And if you're not ready, then dismiss it. Don't even try to understand. You know it's going to be too painful. Now is not the time to do it. But when you are ready, when you feel strong enough, when you feel that you have developed enough other good qualities, that is the time to be honest. So everything is about timing. Everything is about knowing when to do things, and then things will kind of come right as you do that. And when someone like Ajahn Brahmali tells me off, doesn't happen very often. Ajahn Brahmali doesn't tell people off usually. It's not kind of his character. But if he does, or he says something that you might be a telling off. One of the things with the British people, they're so indirect, you know. For a Norwegian, you are direct. You say, this is the way it is. You are bad. This is evil. Don't do that. Okay, I won't do it. Yeah, this is Norway for you. It's very kind of Germanic in that sense. I don't know if we are as direct as the Germans, but we are kind of leaning in that direction, right? And then the British tell you in a kind of roundabout way, no, please tell me. Don't be so roundabout. I don't understand what you're talking about. So you learn after a while, the British, they don't tell things directly. So listen carefully what they're saying. I think there might be a hidden treasure in this kind of indirect words. And so you listen, and when someone like Ajahn Brahm tells you something, you know, it comes from kindness, it comes from a sense of care, it comes from a sense of wanting to help you. And so you take it on board in a much better way. So if you're going to tell someone off, if you want to point out someone else's flaw, don't tell them off because it makes you feel better. Tell them the flaw because you want to help them. Do it out of compassion, do it out of care, because then there is a chance they will listen. Because then they know that you have their best interest at heart. That is how you kind of make people change. And then may still not change, probably they won't, but at least we're giving it a maximum possibility when you do it in that way. So all of these things are this untangling of this knotted ball of thread, the tangled string, and gradually uncovering those attachments and those problems in life. And it does work. I have seen these things happening in my own life. I've been a monk now for 26 years, something like that. And it's slow, and I don't know if because I'm particularly thick or whatever, but it's, gradually it is kind of coming together in the right way. And it's wonderful to see that happen, seeing the spiritual path work, change happening. It's one of those great things. And it gives you great faith on the Buddhist path. And it gives you great faith that you are actually practicing what is the meaning of life. You're not going in circles anymore, just doing the same thing over and over without any real purpose or no real end in sight. You're doing something which actually is going somewhere. You have a feeling that you're heading in a certain direction. This is purposeful. This has a goal. There's an aim in this. We're going somewhere. And that's really powerful to get that feeling. And it gives you the sense that you are on track, and this is about the meaning of life itself, because there's a real goal here. Anyway, so it is because of this that we are so entangled, right? Because we haven't understood these truths, and here specifically dependent origination. And it's because of not understanding this that we haven't escaped the places of loss, the bad places, the underworld. And the last word here, transmigration. Samsara, the round of birth and death, going round and round. Usually at this place it says hell, but here it says transmigration. It's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of nice. It kind of gives a different flavor to this whole thing here. So by understanding dependent origination, what this means is that you become a stream mentor. A stream mentor is a person who is no longer bound for these things. And so basically seeing dependent origination is equivalent to seeing stream mentoring, the same idea, same thing. So why is that? And as we shall see, it is because dependent origination is really just understanding the second noble truth. So it is really understanding the Four Noble Truths. All of these things are kind of interwoven with each other. That makes it very complex and complicated. So there you are. This is the background to this sutta. And before I carry on, I'm going to show my appreciation of this wonderful coffee. It's very nice. I wonder if I'm drinking too much coffee, then I have to be careful. I just spent all morning drinking coffee, now having more. It's kind of worrying. But all right. So now let us. Would you like some water?
I want to do it. I refuse. I will do it. Tiny bit of it come out. It's so easy to say to everyone else, well, you must make good karma and forget to do yourself. It's kind of, the teacher's trap. They have to take the opportunity now. Come on. Okay. So, okay, let's start the dependent origination. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through the sequence fairly quickly, first of all, because just to get an idea, the sequence is repeated 2 or 3 times, so it means that we have a lot of opportunities of going into depth. And by doing it fairly superficially, first of all, it kind of gives us entry point, and then we can go into the details later on. Then. Is anyone who is new to dependent origination here, who has doesn't really have a clue what I'm talking about? Is anyone who is actually one? Okay, yeah. Okay, there's a couple of you who are okay. So this is going to may seem a bit baffling to you when you start out with this, but hopefully you will. Kind of things will start to become clearer as we go along, because it is kind of baffling. I remember when I first read the sequence of dependent origination, I thought, wow, what is this about? This is really weird. What can possibly be the meaning behind these things? And especially some of the causal links are actually very profound and difficult to kind of get your head around, at least initially. But I shouldn't make you too scared, because then you may not understand because you're scared. Actually, it is fully comprehensible. So let us start out. So this is how the Buddha goes. That's what he says. He says, when asked, is there a specific condition for old age and death? You should answer, there isn't. Yes, there is. If they say, what is the condition for old age and death? You should answer, rebirth is the condition for old age and death. So this is, we're now looking at dependent origination in reverse order. We're starting at the end and then going towards the beginning. So the Buddha would teach dependent origination in reverse order. It's called paṭicca-samuppāda in Pali, or in forward order called unravels. He will teach it in the origination sequence, where things kind of originate, and then in the cessation sequence, when everything ceases. So how does old age and death come to be, and how does it come to cease? How does it come to end? These are all the different ways of teaching this. Now, this particular way of teaching, where we start with old age and death, is a very interesting way of teaching, because we're starting with a problem. And then this is, of course, what the Buddha did when he started. We started with a problem. There's a problem here. It's an existential problem. What is the cause of that problem? And then we go backwards, stage by stage, trying to discover the ultimate cause, the root cause, why we have the problem of old age and death, why we have the problem of suffering. This is really why we start in this end. This is kind of exciting, like going on a discovery journey. Okay, what might the cause of old age and death be? Okay, birth, right? Rebirth. That makes sense. If you're born, you have to have old age and die. If you're not born, I guess you won't become old. It kind of makes sense. These things, there's kind of obviousness to that. So then we go backwards and backwards and backwards. We try to find the root cause. It's like a Sherlock Holmes trying to find the kind of the culprit. What is the real culprit here for suffering? This is very exciting, especially for those who haven't seen this before. It's really exciting. The journey of discovery, trying to find the root cause here. So, what is the condition for old age and death? First of all, we should start with this idea of specific condition. What does this mean? The Pali word is ida paccayata. Not have to remember that, by the way. I'm not going to test you on these things. So what is the idea of specific condition then? What does this mean? And what it means is that very often in the world, things have many conditions, many causes that to come into being. Yeah? But often there is one cause or one condition in particular that is the essential one. And that essential condition is the one that makes the other thing happen. So this is what is meant by specific condition, the essential cause or the essential condition that is required for the result to happen. Yeah, so the specific condition for old age and death is birth. Why? Well, because if there is birth, it's guaranteed that you're going to die. Old age is not guaranteed. Yeah? You may not become old, but certainly death is guaranteed if you are born. So this means that this is the specific condition. There are other things too that must work out. Yeah, actually in this case, yeah, to die you also have to have other things. You have to have a heart attack, an illness, or whatever, or you may have to have an accident, or you die of old age, or whatever. These things are also required, but they will happen if you are born. It's guaranteed. Yeah, you're born, guaranteed that you will die. So this is the idea of specific conditionality. And a kind of technical word is that it is a sufficient condition. Birth is sufficient for there to be death. It's a sufficient condition for dying. But the reverse is also true. Yeah? If you don't get born, you won't die. Yeah, and so this works in both ways. If you're born, guaranteed that you will die, but if you're not born, guaranteed you will not die. Yeah, so this is the idea of specific conditionality. It works in both ways. And in a reverse way, there's also a technical term. It's called necessary conditionality. Birth is necessary for there to be death. That's why it's called a necessary condition for dying. So this is the idea of conditionality here in dependent origination. So every stage, as we move back stage by stage, is every link is a necessary and sufficient condition, is a specific condition for the link that comes afterwards. Yeah? Each time it is the same thing as we go backwards to the very beginning. And what that means is that when we come to the root cause, to the very beginning of all of this, when we have done the kind of investigation, come to the very beginning, we know that the root cause is necessary, yeah, for there to be death. Take away the root cause, there will be no death. Also, we know if the root cause is there, guaranteed there will be death, there will be suffering as a consequence. So this is the idea behind this, yeah, and it's fairly obvious. Sometimes when we try to explain these things, they're so much more complex than they actually are, but it's fairly it's actually fairly straightforward, I think. So birth or rebirth is the condition for old age and death, and it's kind of interesting here that we're dealing with old age and death. What happened to good old suffering? What is always talks about suffering? Why are we talking about old age and death here? That's kind of interesting, isn't it? So what is the connection here between suffering and old age and death? Why does the Buddha say suffering? Why does it say old age and death? We need to investigate that. I'm just going to kind of flag to you some of the things that we have to investigate as we go through this. I'm not going to say too much about that now because we get too much into the nitty-gritty, perhaps. I suppose I can say that the old age and death, are often found in these kind of situations because they almost like summarize the problem of suffering. Death is a very, very powerful moment in human existence, obviously, and it kind of draws together all the various kinds of suffering and kind of accumulated in that moment of dying. Yeah, because all of the attachments that we have in the world, all the problems that we have, the suffering of pain, all of those things kind of come together in that point. So death is a very good way of understanding the problem of suffering. This is one reason why it is there. Of course, suffering is a bit broader than it's more than that. But that is one big reason. And the other reason is because death in Buddhism also reminds us of rebirth. Yeah, if you die, then of course things carry on afterwards. The idea of rebirth is absolutely fundamental to the Buddhist teachings. And it is kind of, I think it's a bit sad sometimes when you see in the world, people try to express the Buddhist teaching without rebirth. Okay, it's fine. If you cannot believe in rebirth, that's fine. But don't try to pretend that the Buddha taught the teaching without rebirth. If you do that, you're really misrepresenting the suttas big time. I mean, like really, really big time. Because it distorts the teaching massively if you do that. And this is one of the reasons why it is very interesting here that Bhaktisiddhanta translates jati as rebirth. The usual translation in this kind of situation is to translate it as birth. Yeah, birth is a condition for old age and death. But here he translates as rebirth instead. And it's kind of fascinating. Yeah? So which one is right? Is it birth or rebirth? And the point to remember here is that when the ancient Indians talked about the word jati, yeah, the idea of rebirth was understood. Yeah, jati, an instance of birth, was always an instance of rebirth. Yeah, these two things kind of go together. There's no such thing as birth without rebirth. Yeah, there's no such thing as rebirth, obviously, without birth. These two things go together. So when they heard the word jati, they would hear rebirth. And that would be the implied meaning into that word. So for that reason, if we want to bring out what was actually communicated by this word to the audience in ancient India, rebirth is probably a better translation, because that is what they would have understood when they heard the word jati. So to bring that out to a modern audience, if we just say birth, it never means rebirth. Yeah, for us it has absolutely no connotation to that at all. So to bring out that deeper meaning, actually, I think it is appropriate to translate it as rebirth at this point. And this brings out this other dimension that you never get if you hear the word birth. And at a stroke, you do away with a lot of misunderstandings of what dependent origination is about. Yeah? At a stroke, it becomes impossible to interpret the idea of birth in all kinds of alternative ways, because rebirth, well, that only really has one particular meaning. Okay, so let's, I keep maybe getting a bit too involved already in all of these little things. Let's continue backwards. When asked, is there a specific condition for rebirth? You should answer, there is. If they say, what is the condition for rebirth? You should answer, continued existence is the condition for rebirth. In other words, if you exist, yeah, then that existence leads to rebirth. Here we need to define the word existence quite carefully, because of course even the arahant, even the awakened beings, they exist in a certain way, but they are not reborn. So we need here to understand what is meant by existence or continued existence. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on that later on to understand what that means. When asked, is there a specific condition for continued existence, you should answer, there is. If they say, what is the condition for continued existence, you should answer, grasping is the condition for continued existence. When we grasp things in the world, and grasping is something we do a lot of. Grasping here is really just attachment. Yeah? We attach to things in the world. There's a lot of attachment in our lives. I'm going to investigate this in quite a bit of detail. What kind of attachments are involved with this? And once we are attached to all of these things, once we have become a knotted ball of thread, yeah, like I said at the beginning, once we have become like matted rushes and reeds, well, at that point, our existence takes a certain direction, because our existence depends on our attachments. This is how grasping leads to this idea of continued existence. Existence takes shape depending on the things that we attach to, that we take up, that we grasp in this world. When asked, is there a specific condition for craving? You should answer, there is. If they say, what is the condition for craving? Sorry, lost one day. Specific condition for grasping, there is the condition for grasping is craving. Yeah. Craving is the condition for grasping. Because we crave, we attach to things. Craving makes us attached. Why? Well, because once we attach, it kind of satisfies the craving. That's kind of the purpose of attaching, to satisfy the craving. It doesn't really work, but nevertheless, that's what we do. When asked, is there a specific condition for craving? You should answer, there is. What is that condition? You should answer, feeling is the condition for craving. Because we feel the world, we crave for things. There are good feelings, there are bad feelings, pleasant and unpleasant feelings. And because we obviously, by its very nature, we want the pleasant feelings, we don't want the unpleasant ones. That's kind of the nature of these feelings. That's why they're called pleasant and unpleasant in the first place. Obviously, desire and craving arises because of that. Feeling is one of these pivotal aspects on the Buddhist path, one of the 5 khandhas, the 5 aspects of personality, and it's a pivotal aspect in dependent origination, as we shall see later on. Is there a specific condition for feeling? You should answer, there is. If they say, what is the condition for feeling? You should answer, contact is the condition for feeling. Contact here can be understood as experience, especially the beginning point of experience. So when we experience the world through any of the senses, there's always going to be feeling. Feeling is an integral aspect to experience. You cannot have an experience without feeling. There's going to be some feeling, good, bad, or neutral, with that experience. So when we're talking about feeling here, it's important to understand really what it means, like feeling tone. Is it good, is it bad, or is it neutral? Is it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? That's really all it means. So we have to, when we experience the world, in other words, when we contact the world through the senses, feeling arises. What is the condition for contact? And you should say, name and form are the conditions for contact. Now, this is where things get really mystical. This is where those of you who have never heard of dependent origination before may kind of felt a bit left behind. What on earth is going on? How can name and form be the condition for contact? And the answer to that is quite simply that name and form, this is really the 6 senses and the mind combined. The 6 senses and the mind combined are necessary for there to be experience, right? This is just a way of talking about the 6 senses. In fact, there is what you will have noticed, those of you who know dependent origination, that the 6 senses are missing here. So is this really dependent origination? How can something be missing? This is weird, isn't it? Well, of course, the idea is that there are different ways of expressing dependent origination. In this case, we leave out the 6 senses. And the reason we do that, we'll see later on, it gives you an alternative understanding of this idea of contact, how we contact the world. And this is actually quite interesting, this alternative way of understanding the idea of contact. Name and form leading to experience, to contacting the world. Once we understand that both name and form, mind, and the physical phenomena are required for them to be contacted, then we can start to understand how we can contact the world in a better way, how we can change our mind so that our contacts are more aligned with a moving forward on this path, this practice. This is actually quite interesting. I'll talk about this in much more detail later on. Don't worry too much about it now if it kind of is obscure to you. When asked, is there a specific condition for name and form? You should answer, there is. If they say, what is the condition for name and form? You should answer, consciousness is the condition for name and form. So this, again, may seem really obscure. What on earth is going on here? And you have the right to think that. I'm just letting you know, because if you didn't think that, if you're new to this, you would be enlightened already. So you have the right to think that. And then the next one, when asked, is there a specific condition for consciousness? You should answer, there is. If they say, what is the condition for consciousness? You should answer, name and form are the conditions for consciousness. Consciousness is the condition for name and form. Name and form is the condition for consciousness. And this is a very interesting and profound statement. Again, I'm not going to say too much about it now, but the reason why this is so profound is that it shows that the very consciousness, the most profound aspect of human existence, if there were a self, it is precisely consciousness that we are most likely to take to be that self. Because it is the knower inside that always seems to be present, always seems to be there. It is, in a sense, the kind of final aspect of our existence that we normally can strip away everything else. But what remains then is still consciousness, the final referent to what we would think of as a self usually. So what this is saying is that even that consciousness, even that last thing that we normally take to the final kind of the final thing that we take to be a self, but even that is conditioned, even that is dependent on other things for its existence. And this is one of the most radical things in human thought, in the history of human ideas and human thought, because almost all of human history, especially religious and philosophy, there is this idea that there is something kind of behind the scenes that is always there, especially in religion. And this idea is that consciousness somehow is the permanent aspect of the world, either within individuals or in the larger sense in terms of God or Brahma or whatever. There's always this idea somewhere, almost all religions are like this, there's something permanent in the world. But the Buddha says, no, there's nothing that is permanent. Everything depends on something else. Nothing has independent existence. And this mutual conditionality between name and form and consciousness is kind of the Buddha's way of stating that dependence within dependent origination. So for that reason, it is very important and very interesting. And that is where this sutta stops the sequence of conditionality. It doesn't go beyond that. It starts with name and form. Now, if you count the number of steps here, the number of factors in this particular sequence, you will find there is 9 or 10, depending on whether you count name and form twice or only once. If you count it only once, there's 9 factors. If you count it twice, there's 10 factors. Now, those of you who have been around this before, you know that dependent origination is usually 12 factors, right? So how come there's only 9 here?
Double.
Sorry?
Double.
Double?
Like you said,
the last one is the ornate. Oh, it's okay.
Okay. So it is a very interesting point, and I want to talk a little bit about that. So we're going to 5 minutes left for this one. Maybe I'll go a little bit beyond and see how this goes. But it's very fascinating. There is only 9 factors, or maybe 10. Usually there is 12. So can this be called dependent origination? Usually in the suttas, when the Buddha says this is dependent origination, he says 12 links. That is how it is defined, or 12 factors. That's how it is defined. So how can the Buddha talk about 9? Maybe this is not dependent origination. How do we know? So this is what I'm going to analyze for you. How do we know that something is dependent origination? And this is a surprisingly important thing. Because if we don't know that, and we then come to certain things, we may think they are dependent origination, when in fact they are not. And then we will misunderstand the whole idea of what this is about. So when you read the suttas, and especially when you go to the Nidana Sutta I was talking about before, you find lots of suttas, you find what looks like dependent origination, you find it in 12 factors, you find it with 11 factors, you find it with 10 factors, you find it with 9 factors like here, you find it with 8 factors, with 7, 6, 5, down to 4 factors maybe, right? So are all of these things dependent origination, or are they not? How do we know? What is the way of discovering this? What is the minimum for being dependent origination? If I just have old age and death, is that dependent origination? Well, obviously not, because there's no dependency, there's no kind of causality, right? You have at least have two factors, yeah? Birth giving rise to old age and death. But is that sufficient for dependent origination? Just rebirth and death? Maybe not. So how do we know? And the way to answer this question, and I think it is a very, very significant thing to realize, the way to answer this is to understand that dependent origination originates from the second noble truth. It is an expansion of the second noble truth. It's a filling in of all the gaps in the second noble truth, so as to kind of give that truth a more kind of complete expression. So what are the kind of salient and important points in the second noble truth? So the second noble truth says something like, what is the origin of suffering, right? It is this craving that leads to rebirth, that is conjoined with delight and delight and desire, which finds delight here and there. That is the craving for sensual pleasure, the craving for existence, and the craving for non-existence. Something like that. I think that's fairly close to the expression of the second noble truth. Now, if you analyze those various parts there, you will see that there are certain things that stand out that really kind of are what this is about. First of all, it is the origin of suffering is craving, right? Craving is obviously the really important aspect of this second noble truth. Then there is suffering itself, because suffering is what craving leads to. If you have craving, you will suffer. The suffering is obviously also fundamental for understanding what this noble truth is about. Yeah? The third thing that is very important is the idea of rebirth. It is the craving that leads to rebirth. Paṭicca-samuppāda. Paṭicca literally means that has to do with re-existence. Yeah? Craving, rebirth, and suffering. These are the three salient features of this particular noble truth. These are the significant factors in there. If you look at all the other things in there, they are just expansion on those ideas. The craving that is conjoined with delight and desire. This is non-viraga sahagata. This is just an expansion on the idea of craving, an alternative way of talking about craving. Tatra abhinandini, finding delight here and there, just means that the craving finds delight in different places. It doesn't really add any extra factors to what I've been saying. That is craving for desire, craving for existence, craving for annihilation. That again just expands the idea of what kind of craving we're talking about. So the three things that stand out, that really makes the second noble truth what it is, are craving, rebirth, and suffering. So these are the root factors that decide dependent origination. So if you put suffering, rebirth, craving on a sheet, and then you can fill in the other 12 factors, the other 9 factors of dependent origination, and then it comes out very nicely, and you can see the 3 root things, and then the whole of dependent origination arising, coming out of that. Yeah, so between craving and rebirth, we have the other factors of grasping of existence. Yes, this is like filling in the gaps so as to make it more clear what is going on there. And then the first 6 factors or 7 factors of dependent origination, they give us the cause for craving, why there is craving in the world. So to fill in the kind of preliminary part, helping us to understand what craving, how craving actually comes about. But the root 3 things are these 3 things. And once we see that, once we understand that dependent origination is really just an expression of the second noble truth, then we can also decide what things are dependent origination in the suttas. If it does not include, or at least imply, these 3 things, it is not dependent origination. This is the minimum requirement for it to be this particular teaching. So what does that mean in practice? In practice, what it means is that, I will give you an example. Unfortunately, I can't show these things to you. Usually, when I give some of these things, I have like a screen and I kind of show what's going on. But it doesn't really matter so much. I just want to give you a general idea of what this means in practice. What it means in practice is that there are certain things in the suttas that many people claim to be dependent origination. One example will be the sequence found in the famous sutta known as the paṭicca-samuppāda, the honey ball sutta. It's found in the middle-length sayings, the Buddha number 18. Yeah, it's a very beautiful sutta, very interesting in its own right, certainly. But the question here is whether it is dependent origination or not. Now, what that sutta says, it says the following. It says that dependent on the eye and form, yeah, or the ear and sound, or the tongue and taste, etc., dependent on the eye and form, the eye consciousness arises. Yeah? The coming together of those three, the eye, form, and eye consciousness, that is called contact or experience, if you like. You experience the world when that happens. From that experience, there is feeling. Because of feeling, there is perception. You perceive what you feel. Because of feeling, there is paṭicca, which is thinking. Because of thinking, there is paṭicca. Paṭicca is very interesting Pali word, which means proliferation. Yeah, proliferation means that your thinking just goes in all ways. Yeah, like I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, you sit down, you try to meditate, push the breath, and your mind is just whoa, all over the place, anywhere except with the breath. You know how it goes sometimes. This is called paṭicca in Pali. It sounds a bit like proliferation, right? It's a good word for proliferation. Paṭicca. It sounds like, oh, I'm not really here. I'm kind of back in the wherever, I don't know, you have come from various places and wherever that might be. And then there goes one step further. Paṭicca leads to paṭicca-samuppāda. This is just a further expansion of this idea of proliferating. And people say this is dependent origination. Yeah. And if you say that this is dependent origination, of course, it's a very interesting sequence and it's very meaningful in many different ways. But from what I have just been explaining as being dependent origination, it has to include rebirth and it has to include suffering. Suffering may be implied in this, but rebirth is certainly not implied. You know, this is not dependent origination. It is a very important part for how to understand the human psyche and how our thinking develops, how we tend to be led astray in various ways. It is very important for that, but it is not dependent origination. That is very useful to know, because when you know that, it means that you don't misunderstand the sequence, you don't misapply it to the wrong area, so as to think that dependent origination is just the mind moments being created here and now, without any rebirth being implied by it. So this is why I spent quite a bit of time. For some of you, this may sound very abstruse and strange and hard to understand. Don't worry about it if you do. Remember that it takes a long time to understand all the details of dependent origination. For some of you, this will make sense straight away because you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because these are standard things that are discussed in Buddhist circles once you start to get into the suttas. So, to me, that answers that question once and for all, what dependent origination is, where to find it, and where you will not find it. It helps you to navigate the suttas, it helps you to understand things in the right way, in the right context, and what is the significance of the various suttas when they are, you know, the way they are taught by the Buddha. So, that is plenty enough for now. If I teach you any more, my head might explode. I'm worried about that. My head might explode as well. So I thought if my head is, but maybe your head is even more prone to explosion. So I think we will call it a morning there. So please have a nice meal. Enjoy your day, and then we will come back again. I'll see you back again. Vimala will be back in at 2 o'clock as usual. Yeah, do contemplation every day. Okay, that's wonderful. It's really useful to have a bit of guidance because it reminds you of the essentials of meditation. We're not talking so much about meditation in the suttas. It's great to have that all the time. So, otherwise, we will carry on with this marvelous Dhamma Sutta at 6 o'clock this